Welcome. My name is Fatima, and I am a lead coordinator with the Toronto Peace Initiative, or TPI. The Toronto Peace Initiative is a people-focused, anti-militarism, pro-humanity organization working towards peace, solidarity, and an end to colonialism and imperialism. We are newly rebranded, formerly known as TAPS, or the Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity, and we're a group of dedicated peace activists who are looking forward to promoting and working on community-focused peace and development in Canada and around the world. We're committed to collaborate with friendly organizations who are working towards peace and related social justice issues for workers and poor people of the world. Today, we're going to be hearing from several honored guests for our panel that we are calling The Road to Peace and Development, Forging a Sustainable Future Based on Cooperation and Connections Between China, Canada, and the World. Today's panel is a collaboration between the Toronto Peace Initiative and the Chinese People's Association for Peace and Disarmament, or CPAPD, a Beijing-based peace organization that I've had the honor of meeting in person when I spoke at the UN-sponsored event, the International Day of Peace, held in Nanjing in 2018. As part of a delegation, I got to see Beijing, Wuhan, and Nanjing, as well as several rural villages where the eradication of poverty was in progress. I saw the upgrading of rural housing, the development of town centers, of solar farms that provided much needed electricity to remote areas. Until my trip there, I have to admit, I was more prone to succumbing to the anti-China rhetoric that is so prevalent in Western media from all sides. But after my trip, after I got to see how farmers who used to live in huts were now living in state-of-the-art modern apartments, I saw villages that had been disconnected from the rest of China in the past becoming tourist hubs, and seeing the economic prosperity being brought to all the people of China, I realized that I had been fed a lot of lies about China. And since then, I have worked very hard to try to bridge the divides that seem to exist between China and Canada and the rest of the world. So today we are going to be joined by a number of incredible guests, scholars, journalists, and thinkers who will be speaking to us on various issues related to how we can forge those connections towards peace for the future. Today's event will be split into two sections. So we'll start with section 1. It is unfortunately the reality of our era that hybrid wars in arenas such as science, technology, media, and industry are getting more and more intense between China and the United States. Military conglomerates like NATO, Quad, AUKUS, and others are being led by the US against China and Russia in what the US calls great power competition, but what is becoming more and more a one-sided attack on the development of these countries' economies and technology and the development opportunities they are bringing to poorer countries, mostly former colonies of Western powers. Our first set of panelists are going to address some questions, including how would they understand these coalitions around the world that are being led by the US? Are all of these countries that are in these coalitions really targeting China and Russia as an enemy? Also, what about the military deployment in the Asia-Pacific region that the US is turning up? For example, the RIMPAC war exercises that are currently ongoing and will be until August. These all seem to suggest that there are growing challenges and dangers in the Asia-Pacific region and around China in particular, more than ever before. So we will ask our first set of panelists to discuss these issues from their perspectives. First up is Ian Goodrum. Ian is a journalist and a correspondent with China Daily, and he's based in Beijing. So Ian, please come up and tell us what you think.
Thanks a lot, and I appreciate everyone having me here. And it's I'm in great company, and I feel almost like I'm out of place among so many people that I respect and admire so greatly. But I will do my best to earn my spot. So I want to start with some rhetorical questions. You might know the answers to them, you might not. But I want to ask, well, it's the same question, really. Does anyone remember Power Africa? Okay. Does anyone remember the Blue Dot Network? Now, this is from last year. Does anyone remember Build Back Better World? This is more recent, so people probably know this one. But I will tell you what they were and are. Power Africa was a 2013 initiative from the Obama administration to supposedly electrify sub-Saharan Africa and bring hundreds of millions of people access to electricity, which they do not regularly have. It was a big nothing, as you might expect. They didn't do any of that. They pledged millions of dollars, billions of dollars to expand electricity infrastructure to this portion of the continent. They made big promises. There were big ceremonies. There were some articles in the major corporate press, and some kind of eye-catching numbers and headlines, and then nothing. Blue Dot Network is a precursor to Build Back Better World. It's a similar kind of international, supposedly infrastructure-based network led by the U.S. To kind of counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. That has also gone by the wayside. It got incorporated into Build Back Better World, and then of course Build Back Better World itself has fallen off the face of the earth. It's been reincorporated again, rebranded, because the Build Back Better initiative within the US was a spectacular failure. So we have several supposed projects that were meant explicitly or implicitly to counter China's Belt and Road. And they've come to very little in terms of actual spending, in terms of actual building of infrastructure, in terms of actual impact. Now, since Power Africa was explicitly about electrification, I want to give you a different set of figures. From 2010 to 2015, the African continent added 20 gigawatts of electricity. Of that 20 gigawatts, 16.5 gigawatts were built and powered up through Chinese projects. Fully over three quarters of the new electricity that was generated in Africa was generated in whole or in part with the help of Chinese firms, Chinese contractors, and Chinese investment. So we have a big nothing on one hand, and on the other hand, we have three quarters of all new electricity generation for a 5-year period. So you might be asking, why bring this up? What is the importance of talking about the inaction of the US despite the big rhetoric, despite the big talk? The reason is that if you think about infrastructure and development in terms of a economic and social process, you can also think about them in terms of the carrot and the stick, right? These countries in the global south that were colonial subjects for many, many decades or centuries, escaped colonialism, traditional colonialism, largely in the 20th century, although there were fledgling movements of national liberation and some successes earlier than that. The big post-colonial movement happened in the 20th century, and there was, in the place of the old colonial system, a system of neo-colonial exploitation. So part of it is this financialization of the economy and this moving past the kind of traditional exploitative networks, but also having the right hand engage in the exploitation while the left hand talks about peace, development, and infrastructure and all these things. So you have to put on a face. But despite that human face on neocolonialism, the exploitation continues. The underdeveloped countries remain overexploited rather than actually underdeveloped, as the quote would have it. And so the difference is that with China's investment and with China's development and partnerships in the global south, things are actually happening, right? Countries are getting the infrastructure they need to develop themselves, to stand up on their own and be sovereign and not be colonial or neo-colonial subjects anymore, right? And there is a mutually beneficial arrangement to that relationship. But the point being, it's not purely extractive or exploitative the way the old colonial relationship was, or the neo-colonial relationship continues to be. So what does this have to do with these kinds of military coalitions, these kinds of buildings of camps, the creation of blocks, the formation of antagonistic groups of countries to contain and to blunt this effort? Well, again, the US and other countries might talk a big game, but when it comes to actually doing things, they are constrained by the reality of the economic arrangement that is imperialism. They are incapable of building the real infrastructure, the real development, and creating the real development that would allow these countries to escape their shackles, to break free, and to engage with the world and to participate in the world economy on their own terms, the same way China did after its revolution. And the maintenance of that relationship is essential to continue the growth and the wealth and the extraction of surplus value that is necessary to sustain capitalism through imperialism. And so any kind of alternative arrangement wherein a country is given, you know, this kind of infrastructural, not necessarily aid, but certainly assistance, and eventually supplanting kind of the imported labor, the imported know-how and expertise, and the imported resources with local labor resources, with local expertise, training people in the population to do this stuff themselves, which is what characterizes the Chinese relationship to Africa as well. This breaks the chain. This breaks the chain of exploitation. You will soon have countries taking their own way. And so that is unacceptable. And because the US and other countries in the capitalist, the advanced capitalist global north cannot offer an alternative, because doing real development and real infrastructure and engaging in this process would cut off the money chain, the value chain for themselves, the surplus value chain for themselves. They must resort to, instead of the carrot, the stick. And this is what we get with the formation of AUKUS, the military bloc between Australia, the US, and the UK and the US, in which military technology and expertise is shared to an even greater extent than it was before. Of course, already these countries had a very cozy relationship in terms of their intelligence sharing and information intelligence gathering, information sharing. But this makes it even more of an explicit military arrangement, wherein military technology will be shared among the countries, particularly nuclear submarines. And the Quad, the alliance between Australia, the US, Japan, and India, similarly engaging in kind of bloc containment efforts against China and as a counter to China's own development of international relationships on the basis of mutual respect and mutual benefit. These are military, political, economic arrangements, but they are also an extension of the already existing relationships in international economy, international relations. This new kind of attempt at containment, this new aggression, this new kind of response is not a totally new phenomenon in terms of how it represents the state of the world, but it is certainly more explicit and more direct and more threatening and more challenging to the notion of peace, which I think we all can appreciate is an important value to hold. But in this new context, we need to be constantly thinking about not just how to oppose these alliances, but also explain where they come from, the fundamentals of the undergirding relations, the fundamentals of the theory, right? That we have a basis and a framework for understanding this, and it's been around for over 100 years. It's Marx's theory of capital and it's Lenin's theory of imperialism, right? Like these are older texts, but they're not outdated, and so we can apply these in our understanding. And so thinking about this in this new context, we have to oppose this escalation, and we have to oppose this kind of heating up, but we have to also talk about the roots and the systems of exploitation that make that motivate these actions, because until those systems are cut off at the root, there will be no way to just as China has done with its relationships with the global South, there's no other way to break that chain, right? So those of us that are doing this work for solidarity should continue to do so. Those of us that are in the belly of the beast, as it were, should be doing all they can to oppose these arrangements and explaining what they mean and what they do and how they hurt the chances and the opportunities for world peace. The other thing that I wanted to add before my time, which may already be up, I don't know. But the other thing that I want to emphasize is that even though these new alliances and these new relations are intensified and more more aggressive, there are still divisions that take place within these relationships. The creation of AUKUS, right? The sale of nuclear submarines to Australia scuttled a deal with France that Australia had, right? France was not too happy about that. That created some tension, that created some conflict, even within the established colonial, neo-colonial, imperialist arrangements under this advanced stage of capitalism. The Russia-Ukraine war, right, has created a tremendous amount of conflict. The Quad, right, is having some tension because India maintains an independent foreign policy and continues to have good relations with Russia, and that's unacceptable to the U.S. and many countries in Europe, and so there's been some friction there. We are not, and the same way that Lenin discussed in imperialism, these alliances, despite the massive benefit they bring and the massive amount of exploitative extraction that takes place within them, have their venality, and they have their backbiting, and they have their conflict that can be exploited, right? That can be used to intensify divisions and break up the efficiency of the cycle, and can cut off is another way to kind of put some cracks in the structure, in the structure that undergirds imperialism. To do that, and this is explicitly again talked about by Lenin, to do that, opposition to these blocs and this kind of new Cold War and this aggression must be unified, must be collaborative, must be strong, because the taking advantage of the disunity among these powers is how a unified movement of workers and peace activists and people who are for a healthy planet, not besmirched by the horrors of war and conflict. If we are genuinely interested in doing that, we have to figure out ways to stay united and become the critical mass that is necessary to end these trends and to stop them before they escalate into something far worse. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was excellent. Yes, lots of thought, lots of food for thought. And we are going to be having a short discussion after the next two speakers. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, whose name is Professor Zhao Minghao. Professor Zhao is the Senior Fellow at the Institute of International Studies and Center for American Studies at Fudan University. Professor Zhao, please come up.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for this invitation. And I'm very pleased to join today's discussion. And I appreciate the efforts of CPAPD and Toronto Peace Initiative. I'd like to talk about my observations on US-China relations and Asia-Pacific security situation. As Karen highlighted that US-China relations have fallen into a cold peace, various new type of wars in science, technology, economy, and military arena. The Indo-Pacific has been the central arena for Sino-US strategic competition, though Beijing still prefer the concept of Asia-Pacific. rather than Indo-Pacific. The emergence of Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical concept is closely related to America's efforts to curb the rise of China. Washington envisions a more networked regional security architecture, or use the words of Ian, or new alliance, or a latter's word of alliance and partnership, a more networked regional security arrangement, combined with the so-called integrated deterrence against China, emphasized by Secretary Austin, to maintain U.S. primacy in this region. The Biden administration have upgraded the Quad mechanism, including its first face-to-face summit in October 2021, and the second face-to-face summit in Tokyo in May. The four countries, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, have set up several working groups on protecting advanced technologies, safeguarding rare earth metal and reshaping supply chains. The Quad countries conducted the Malabar naval exercise in August 2021. So the military component of this grouping, of this bloc, is increasing. And Beijing has worried about the possibility of an Asian version of NATO based on the Quad. And actually, we also say the US is now pushing NATO to, expand the influence and the footprints of NATO in Asia Pacific, such as sending, more warships of NATO member states to this region. It's an also alarming thing for Beijing. The Biden administration is also working hard to forge a Quad Plus mechanism, pushing more allies and partners to join the bloc. South Korea, the Philippines, and Vietnam are all potential recruits in this bloc. The Biden administration is also trying to get European countries such as Britain and France to become part of the Quad Plus. In particular, Britain is substantially strengthening its security ties with Japan and other Quad members by permanently deploying warships in the Indo-Pacific. And Britain politicians, they talk about the so-called global NATO. This buzzword is a varying trend, I think, for security of Asia Pacific. And they even support NATO's interference into the Taiwan issue. That's a very dangerous thing. AUKUS, a trilateral security pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, was established in September 2021. This military arrangement centered on deterrence and was considered by Beijing to be the embodiment of the new Cold War mindset in Washington. Australia would not only possess at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines with support of the US and UK by 2040, but also host American fighters, bombers, and advanced missiles on its territory. Although the Australian government claimed that it does not seek to acquire nuclear weapons, Canberra's decision may encourage more countries to exploit the loophole in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to be assertive in the nuclear field. And actually, the regional countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, have voiced their worry on the armed race spurred by AUKUS in this region. Besides China, ASEAN countries, they have voiced deep concerns over U.S. New alliance strategy in this region. So I want to quote former Indonesia ambassador to the United States, Dino Dijala. She is an Indonesia politician, a senior diplomat, and she said, the picture is one of 3 Anglo-Saxon countries drumming up militarily in the Indo-Pacific region. So obviously, Southeast Asian countries are worried that AUKUS and Quad would erode ASEAN's centrality in regional affairs. So you know the ASEAN's centrality, that's very important for safeguarding the regional stability. The Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy tends to put more emphasis on military affairs. Yet the real challenge to regional countries lies in the economic downturn and the non-traditional security fields, such as climate change and food security. Washington is still bound by domestic populism and economic nationalism, and it lacks effective economic instruments. So the Washington has proposed the Indo-Pacific economic framework. However, people doubt how much money the U.S. would put for this initiative. And I think Ian has said that the PGII, whether PGII or B3W, the U.S. tend to provide counter initiative to BRI. However, people are, doubting the sustainability of such initiative and how much resources, how much money the U.S. can invest for those initiatives in the end, because we say it's very difficult even for the U.S. to spur the domestic infrastructure building in light of the polarized political struggle in the United States. As a comparison, Beijing seems to be quite clear about where the key arena of great power competition is located. It's economy, it's development. It realizes the magic weapon for the long game between China and the US lies in sustaining and expanding its economic integration with regional countries. China has ratified the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. It's a free trade agreement. In March 2021, China has also applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. China also proposed to be part of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, which was signed by Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile in June 2020. So you can say China's economic integration with the regional countries actually it goes higher, and the U.S. is quite reluctant to join the free trade arrangement in this region, remains outsider all these economic pacts. The last but not least point I want to make is the Taiwan issue. The Taiwan issue is undoubtedly the wild card in the Sino-US strategic competition and security of this region. As the Economist magazine declared, Taiwan has become the world's most dangerous place. Beijing has noticed Washington's departure from the long-held American policy of strategic ambiguity over the Taiwan issue. The American politicians frequently refer to Taiwan as a country. That's ridiculous. Disregard for the one China principle, insistently eroding the political foundation of Sino-US ties. And Beijing accused Washington of sending wrong signals to Taiwan. Although the White House and the US Department of State insist that America's one China policy has not changed, Beijing is preparing for a big storm across the Taiwan Strait. And the House Speaker, Mrs. Pelosi, would make a trip to Taiwan in early August. That's definitely a very dangerous thing for US-China relations. And some US politicians, they even support the redeployment of US militaries in Taiwan. or the and enhancing the arms deal to Taiwan, and the so-called Taiwan Policy Act is, has been proposed in American Congress. So that's great shock. That's great heavy blow to the political foundation of U.S.-China relations. The bottom line is the Taiwan issue has become the front line of Sino-U.S. rivalry, and the risks of a fatal conflict in the coming years should not be underestimated. The tension over the Taiwan issue would have enduring spillover effects on regional security, and all parties need to find ways to prevent the war transitioning from cold to hot between China and the United States. I stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. Yeah, very salient points. I am watching in the news, the way that Nancy Pelosi's plans to visit Taiwan are being presented. And it's absolutely unnecessary, especially considering the kind of situation that the people of the United States are facing, for them to, do this kind of posturing and saber rattling and whatnot. So thank you for your words. Next, we will hear from Nigel Cheriyan. Nigel is a coordinator with the Toronto Peace Initiative, and they will be speaking on China's relationship, and especially in relation to the BRI, with a focus on India-China relations. So Nigel, please come up.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be echoing a lot of what was already said here, but perhaps from a different perspective. The perspective here that I would like to bring to the table is the framing of a struggle, a common struggle that happens in the global South. I think the conversation needs to be framed historically. What's happened? How do these countries behave historically? How has alliances come to fruition in a historical sense? And in this way, we can see that a lot of the countries that we're talking about, Asian countries especially, you can see that they've sort of had similar narrative growth, similar sort of colonization, resource extraction, followed by an independent struggle of some variety, and an eventual independence of some variety. And the magnitude to which each has an individual component of that is enough for an entire degree in itself. But it is interesting that a lot of these countries in the global South have gotten independence at the same time. And in this respect, India and China, I often think of as being very good case studies of relations in these areas, because India gained independence from the British about the same time that the People's Liberation Army was fighting and struggling against the imperialists there. And so the conversation that we need to have is, where are they now? China remains at this point working towards peace and towards social progress for its citizens, and they've worked towards decreasing starvation in its communities and its people, and has generally been accepted by its people as being a heavy good, whereas India remains in a different place altogether, with tumultuous political situations almost constantly, with difficult, still struggling with a lot of the colonial laws and constitutions that were enforced upon us even during the British time, maintaining some of those things as if they speak to our own heritage in some way. Whereas China's been able to progress in some significant ways towards truly making itself independent and sovereign and loved by its citizenry. And so and another important component of this is the Cold War and the Sino-Soviet split. in India and China have had difficulties sort of in the specifics of border disputes between the two countries due to colonial borders that we share, and they've been sort of small fights here and there, and further during the Cold War, India has sort of faced towards Soviet Russia as opposed to China, and since the fall of Soviet Russia, it's sort of important to remember that India was found at a place at a loss. It had lost its sort of benefactor and its close friend, and it had nowhere to go. So it approached the world in an amount of fear. And I think this is the appropriate framing for a lot of the countries that surround China and the big conversations we need to be having about how peace is discussed, namely fear. A lot of these countries act on significant fear of the imperialism that the US has done when those countries have not bowed to those interests and to those things. So it strikes me that a lot of India has been attempting to do the sort of non-affiliated strategy that was there, and then eventually broken apart by American imperialism. And now we have to approach the fact that non-alliance is no longer possible, and that the USSR has fallen. So how do we as India approach the world stage when we feel like we're not economically at a place where we're sovereign? We're not economically at a place where we can fully maintain a diplomatic situation that's completely favorable to the citizenry. So we bend our whims to the US regularly. We do these things that often are counterintuitive to the things that we would actually want, a good sovereign peace policy that benefits us. And a lot of the discourse in the imperial core has been specifically about phrasing that like every country needs to get involved with every other country's business. And that's not true for most countries in the political zeitgeist outside of America are not interested in getting involved in other people's politics. And that's the crucial thing. But India, in this case, acts in a way of fear. But at the same time, the fact is that these countries are in close proximity, share these common values, share these common histories, share a lot of similar cultures, from simple things like kanji or kanji to bigger things like religions and things of those natures. The ancient history that lays between the two of them is undeniable. And so there's this contradiction here of the behavior of India and these other countries stuck in a political situation of fear and trying to look towards the future. And China has put forward a lot of its best foot forward and helped India in improving its own infrastructure, helped with business and all of those things. And those are things that America has not done for the most part. It has not benefited India in these like significant ways that China has approached India with. And so it is, in my view, hopeful, because India is not in India's best interest to face towards America. It isn't close geographically. It doesn't have this cultural heritage and shared history. It's very scared of America, and that isn't the bounds for a good friendship and a good cooperation between peoples. How do you build a trust when you're afraid of someone else? And China has laid the groundwork for that work. And that is what I'm fundamentally hopeful for, that these two relationships can be strengthened. And we see those things in the fact that bilateral trade has increased year on year and hit an all-time high of $125 billion in 2021. Inextricably, our friendships in the two are tied together. And it's a question of China continuing to show that it is possible to come to the table as equals, as partners, and to commit to each other in significant ways and not have to fear violent repercussion for not bowing to the whims of America. So I am perhaps naive, but I am hopeful, because I think that in the case of India and the case of a lot of these Asian countries, that there's this inherent friendship between these countries that doesn't exist between America, and that they've been harassed by them for so long. But that's everything I had to say.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you very much. It's a very important point to consider the historical materialist context for why we are in the position we're in. So thank you to all three of our speakers for this section. There are a couple of questions that I will ask. So if you can take just a few minutes to address some of these questions that have come up. So first of all, for Ian, there's actually two questions. I'll try to combine them because they're very similar. So basically, what are some of these points of inner conflict or contradiction within the imperialist bloc that you were referring to? And more specifically, taking advantage of the splintering of former alliances over newer policies such as France versus AUKUS that you were referring to, what are some things that civilians, like average everyday people who are living in the imperial core in Canada or US, for example, what are the things that civilians can do to take advantage of some of these ruptures and place a more sort of solid wedge between these imperialist factions in order to prevent any reconciliation within an imperialist for basically imperialist purposes? So what would you say are some of those rifts, and what can we do about them?
Well, I mean, it's the conflict between like the national bourgeoisie and the imperial bourgeoisie, right? It's like factions within the capitalist class within these countries and internationally, right? Because you have the more internationally minded kind of, I mean, I think it often falls along, like in terms of political formations, I would say that the international kind of finance capital is better represented by the Democratic Party in the US and the more nationalist, like national bourgeoisie, like isolationists kind of exploit within our borders, but we don't want to exploit outside the world. We want to exploit good American workers, the Republican side. So, I mean, that doesn't mean allying with one faction over the other, because they have their cleavages and their conflicts. I think the outward expression of activity would be mostly the same as what any kind of anti-war, pro-peace activism would be. Just emphasizing that this is a bad, why this is bad, what it could lead to, who's really benefiting, right? Like who is getting the lion's share of the benefit from this. And it's in the case of like a France or a country that's being, feels wronged in a particular alliance, it could be the US, but within the US, the answer is of course that the capitalist class benefits. And so you frame it within the notion of class politics and say, so, I mean, functionally it's not that different. It's just a question of recognizing these intra-class struggles as we see them and figuring out what would best advantage the overall goal, right? And so it's just a question of analysis more than like, I mean, the messaging might change and the rhetoric might change, but the substance of action will remain focused on no war, no Cold War. We want peace. We don't want this kind of escalating conflict, because that's the primary struggle, right? That's we're trying to prevent the worst of all possible outcomes, and then if that struggle reaches its conclusion, then we move on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And so it becomes a longer process. But right now, the emphasis is, of course, like no Cold War, no war, like none of this kind of escalation. It creates tension and creates the conditions by which we could enter a global conflict. So that's what I would say. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Democrats versus Republicans in the U.S. or similar sort of strats, the strata in Canada, I do find that the sort of more liberal left Democrat types tend to be more anti-Russia. And then you have your conservatives who are not as anti-Russia, but both seem to have a problem with China, which is what amazes me, is that they seem to find unity over that. You know, we have Nancy Pelosi coming, and she's a Democrat, supposedly. So, you know, it just, yeah. I mean, I agree with you. There are cleavages. There are obviously, and I think one of the issues is that the economic question. So where, you know, the economies of China and the rest of the world are tied together, including the China and the US, and who stands to benefit from further alienation of China. Thank you for that, Ian. So I have a question for Professor, well, let me ask Nigel, and then I'll come to Professor Zhao. So Nigel, I wanted to ask, what about the bourgeois class in India that is invested in a Western alliance? Being from South Asia myself, I know that is quite a significant power within these countries. Mostly they're the ruling class of these countries. These could be business owners or, you know, people just who have connections with imperialists, the imperial bourgeois, the national bourgeoisie, which has connections with the imperialists abroad. So would they not stand in the way of a closer relationship between India and China? And if you could talk to them, or, you know, what would you say to them?
And yes, there is a tendency towards the bourgeois of India specifically facing towards America, because, and I think beyond the conversation of fear that we've had, a thing that America has been particularly successful at, in India at least, is propagandization, and especially the mythos of like the American dream is quite prevalent with the bourgeois. You know, when you watch movies, anything of that variety in India, you know, they hearken to the American businessman as being the quintessential ideal. And so there is an element, a cultural element to it that is an uphill battle for these bourgeois, but also a class element. However, it strikes me that all of the benefits that the bourgeois have with America, economically, China also benefits India in significant ways too. It's not as if China seeks to come into the country and completely redux the ways that India is aligned. It seeks to offer a helping hand, and so there isn't necessarily a threat that is felt by the bourgeois from China in the same ways, even though the Indian bourgeois feels the opulence of America is desirable. China is not a threat to their business. It is part and parcel. And I think given that China has shown itself to be much less erratic and emotional to the whims of India's preferred international policy choices, that there becomes a natural alliance and a natural systemic alliance that extends above the bourgeois in this way because of its long history as an imperialized and colonized nation. I think primarily that is the thing that is driving the international policies of India in a significant way, is that this history of colonization, the history of being imperialized and cheap labor and resource extraction by these Western countries. And I think Indians and even the bourgeois in India are pretty aware of that. And so I think there's this systemic element to which there's a natural tendency towards this affiliation between China and India, because of this history as colonized nations, as imperialized nations, and also because India historically hasn't wanted to play ball on literally everything that America has said. And so there's, I think that's, it's regardless of the wishes of the bourgeois, it's sort of inevitability either forced on by the imperialists, by America themselves. Either they will put a stop to the trade between America and India, or that natural progression will continue happening because of cultural similarities, of literal proximity, and things of that variety.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I definitely think that there's something there in terms of you made some excellent points. So the bourgeoisie of India and of South Asia in general, but also specifically of India, really do need to consider that China has a much bigger and growing sort of middle class, which, they can export to and things like that, which, provide a much more stable economic market than, for example, the West, where there's a lot more financial, economic, ups and downs. And there's serious problems in the economies of the West, and they're going to only get worse. The contradictions here are only going to sharpen because our governments here don't care about the so-called middle class here. So thank you for that, Nigel. And finally, Professor Zhao, if you could just tell us, in your studies, I'm curious, what are some of the points of cooperation that you think are still possible between the United States and China? So, what are some areas where, I know maybe not the governments are as cooperative with each other, but are there certain areas where there might still be room for cooperation? Thanks.
Yes, Karen, that's a very good question. I think the collaboration actually is still possible for the two giants amid the Cold War atmosphere. The first thing I would say that is climate change that would have, catastrophic implications for the human community. And second thing I would say that is food security, especially in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The world actually is confronting a very big crisis of food security, especially for people living in developing countries in African continent, even in Latin America, many parts. So this food security issue is quite urgent and quite real. Third thing, I think that is energy security. And actually, China is a very big consumer of oil and energy in the world. And actually the US also, has, big concerns over the stability of global energy supply and energy landscape. In terms of, we can combining the climate change, climate cooperation and energy cooperation, because people tend to find ways to explore the usage of renewable energy. However, a trend is that the US want to maintain and enhance its competitiveness in the field of clean energy. Even, take advantage of some very strict measures to push forward with kind of technological decoupling in this field. That's very bad thing, I think. And last but not least, I think the US-China still need to think of the possibility working together in the security field, such as non-proliferation field. US and China are very, they have responsibilities to, safeguarding the non-proliferation regime in the world, and also to confront the challenges related to non-traditional security challenges such as terrorism and such as the security issue related to climate change, environment degradation. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do, but the first thing is that the US need perceive China have have our objective perception of China. not only taking China as an enemy, rival, as an evil, or just use a binary perspective to look at the current world affairs, divide the world into the camp of the so-called democratic countries, or camp of authoritarian countries. No, the warfare, the on ground, the reality on ground is not that binary, right? So I think the US side need to correct their perception on China. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhao. Very, very well. Great points. Yes, there are so many points. Right now in the West, it feels, and it is, that there's entire industries that are built on hating China, misrepresenting China, showing China in the worst possible light. It's even like a joke where it's like, no matter what China does, Western media will say, but at what cost? Like no matter what, even the best things they do, that they're never seen as, the Western media will never doesn't present them, especially, and it's getting, worse. It didn't used to be like this. I think the more that China has grown in its economic capacity and also, with the advent of the Belt and Road, I think it has really just made the Western powers very uneasy that their former colonies could be as developed as them someday. I think that's part of the issue. But you're right. The climate change, for example, climate catastrophes that are already continuing are a huge portion. One of the things I love about China that I got to experience myself are the high-speed rails. China, as of now, as of 2022, has, I believe, about 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. I believe the United States has, I don't know how much, but I know Canada has none. The West talks a big talk about climate change, but it has made no actual commitments, and almost like no movement has been made. In fact, they're moving. Biden is drilling for more oil than ever before. They're trying to sell gas. They're fracking more and more for gas that they want to sell to Europe. So there's just all kinds of contradictions in the West. And the issue here is that people in the West don't understand China. They buy into the lies that China is this authoritarian, country. I mean, when I went to China, I've never seen so many people arguing with, cops on the street, just like randomly food sellers or people, and the cops are very helpful. I cannot believe anybody who has ever been to China would think that people in China are scared, are being oppressed by their government. It's absolutely a joke. Like if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I might believe it, but I've seen it. So that doesn't work on me. So I want to say thank you to all three of our speakers for this section. We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we are going to continue. We're going to talk with Ben, Norton, Professor Liu, and with Q, Anthony Omene, about some more global geopolitics, and especially with an eye on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So let's take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we'll be back. This is section 2 of our panel discussion today. As we sit here, past the 5-month anniversary of the start of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, it is increasingly obvious to everyone paying attention that that conflict is about Russia versus NATO, led by the US, which has continued to threaten Russia's borders and is now suffocating the EU countries' own economies by forcing them to forego cheap and nearby sources of energy from Russia in favor of more expensive and more ecologically damaging energy from United States' corporations. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has emerged as the largest shooting war between the West and Russia since the Cold War. It stands to directly reshape the geopolitical future of Europe and even the whole planet. At present, we can see Western countries led by the US have adopted measures of scores of sanctions against Russia, which are often hurting Western countries, but in particular, developing countries the most. At the same time, there are many gatherings, events against NATO and against US imperialism happening in North America and Europe. It seems that fewer and fewer people here have an appetite for perpetual war, which is why Western media and technology corporations like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Google, and others have clamped down and censored many alternative news platforms and labeled others like Chinese media organizations with ominous-sounding warnings. These warnings by supposedly independent technology corporations always target the countries that the US State Department has declared an adversary. An ironic fact that technology companies censor other countries' media on the grounds that they are, quote, state affiliated, while themselves doing the bidding of the United States state. Our next set of panelists are going to address some of the questions like, how would they assess the current Russia-Ukraine conflict and the sanctions adopted by the West on Russia? How do these sanctions affect countries in Africa in particular and other parts of the world? What would be the fundamental reasons for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in their opinion? What would be the long-term and profound impacts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the global peace movement? So first up, we're going to be hearing from Ben Norton. Ben is a journalist and film producer, and he's the editor of Multipolarista, and he'll be speaking with us from Latin America. Please come on when you can, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure being here with so many great speakers. I want to talk about something that I think is extremely important, probably the most important issue in the world today. That is the new Cold War, the second Cold War that the United States is waging, not only on Russia, we can see that clearly in the proxy war in Ukraine, but also on China. We see that the third in line for the US presidency. So after the US president, you have the vice president. After the vice president, you have the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is taking a very provocative action in basically taking a move toward supporting secessionists in Taiwan, which is a Chinese province. We see that the Pentagon has just released a statement saying that they're potentially considering sending fighter jets to accompany Pelosi as she goes to Taiwan and is not going to mainland China. This is an extremely provocative act. Of course, at the same time, the United States is flooding Ukraine with weapons. The US alone has already sent more than $50 billion of weapons, along with billions more from other members of NATO and the European Union. This is, unfortunately, a new Cold War. We have to be very clear about that. The second Cold War. And like the first Cold War, the new Cold War is an economic conflict. The US-led neoliberal capitalist model is trying to impose itself on the global South, and especially on countries like China and Russia, where there is still significant state control of the economy on behalf of the people. China still has a socialist economic model. The land is publicly owned. The largest banks are publicly owned. Companies representing around 40% of GDP are publicly owned. Similarly, in Russia, the largest companies are state-owned. They're the companies that own the natural resources in Russia, which Western corporations would like to get their hands on, get access to. So this new Cold War has manifested itself in proxy conflicts in regions around the world. We see this now clearly in the war in Ukraine, where the US has CIA forces on the ground. It also has special operations commandos who are on the front lines. Basically, the US is waging a war on Russia in every single way except for having boots on the ground. That's the only real final step the US could take to escalate this conflict that it's waging, this war. And we see now the US escalating the conflict with China. And Ukraine is certainly not the only region of the world. We see that in Africa, the United States has established a massive military footprint through the African Command, AFRICOM. There are dozens of countries in the African continent where the US has special operations forces working and doing shadowy activities that we don't even know about, including citizens who are supposedly part of a democracy, and yet we're not informed by what our government is doing supposedly in our name. Of course, the US government never acts in the name of the actual people of the United States. It acts in the name of large corporate interests that dominate the political class. And of course, in my brief remarks here, I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about another region of the world where we see the new Cold War being waged, and that is, of course, Latin America. So I talked about, the US trying to support secessionist movements in Taiwan, the proxy war in Ukraine, and I think in Latin America, we are going to see another major flashpoint of conflict. We see more and more US officials are invoking the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine. This dates back to 1823. Next year is the 200th anniversary. This is an explicitly colonial doctrine that goes back to the classical era of British colonialism. And in the context of China, the century of humiliation in which European and also the US colonial powers tried to carve up China in using these colonial tactics that they also used in other parts of Asia and Africa and Latin America. Well, the US equivalent of that, the Monroe Doctrine, is becoming more and more prominent in the language we hear from US politicians, including both former secretaries of state under Donald Trump, Rex Tillerson, who is himself a lobbyist for the oil industry, and also Mike Pompeo, former CIA director. Both of them invoked the Monroe Doctrine in regards to Latin America. We've also seen that numerous politicians, including John Bolton, who oversaw the coup attempt in Venezuela, he invoked the Monroe Doctrine repeatedly. And we've seen since then that numerous members of Congress, including Matt Gaetz, a congressman from Florida, invoked the Monroe Doctrine on the floor of the US Congress just a few months ago in order to claim that Argentina was a threat to US national security. Why did he say that Argentina, a country thousands of kilometers away, supposedly threatens US national security? It was because the democratically elected president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, took a trip to both Russia and China and signed economic agreements with the leaders of both countries and joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Argentina is not the only country in Latin America that has joined the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm speaking right now from Nicaragua. Nicaragua recently joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Cuba has also joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Venezuela has been participating in the Belt and Road Initiative for several years, and there are other countries in the region that are also collaborating with China in this massive global infrastructure project. Now, we've seen 200 years of US colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism in Latin America. What infrastructure has that brought the region? Very little. Instead, we've seen that there's a very long and established history of the United States trapping countries, not only in Latin America, but around the global South, in odious debt and using the IMF and the World Bank and that odious debt to impose neoliberal structural adjustment programs on countries in the region. So they privatize their assets to North American corporations. So they liberalize their economies, deregulate industries that are important for their local economy, devastating local economies, cut workers' protections. This is a pattern that we've seen repeated again and again and again. So why are countries in Latin America increasingly turning toward China and also Russia and also Iran for new economic opportunities? Because those countries do not impose the same political and economic conditions that the United States has done for decades now on Latin America. Because of that, China has become the largest trading partner for South America. Also, there's the fact simply that China is a country that has gone through Western colonization. It understands what imperialism is, the pain of colonization, and has dedicated itself, the Communist Party of China has dedicated itself to combating that colonialism that devastated the country and led to the century of humiliation. So there's certainly also, there are political bonds between countries in Latin America and China. It's not a mystery why people would see it that way. And I think that we need to be very concerned because increasingly, given China's growing economic relationship, which is completely bilateral with countries in the region, they're not being forced to do trade with China. They're doing it because they're being given better opportunities from China, and they're also being given access to Chinese markets. And of course, the Chinese market is absolutely massive as the most populous country on earth. So this is mutually beneficial for the people of China and for the people of Latin America. China is also, along with Brazil, a member of the BRIC system: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is soon to be expanded potentially into the BRICS, which brings two I's, India and also Iran, and then an A, which is Argentina. So Brazil being the largest economy in Latin America with the largest population in Latin America, Argentina having the third largest economy in Latin America after Mexico in second place. This is another significant shift toward South-South cooperation, integration of countries in the global South that want to develop their countries on a mutually beneficial bilateral basis. This is all completely antithetical to the neoliberal model that the United States has imposed, which is free trade only for US corporations, devastating local economies in the regions, de-developing countries as opposed to developing infrastructure. I mean, we've seen this again and again. I'm a permanent resident of Nicaragua. And in this country, during the neoliberal era, from 1990 until 2006, in which there were a series of US-backed right-wing governments, the country was de-developed, not developed. It was de-developed, underdeveloped. We saw health indicators decreased, education problems increased. So that's the reality of the US Washington consensus, the neoliberal model imposed on the region. Now we see that China has been partnering, especially with the progressive governments in the region, that are investing state resources, not only in infrastructure, but in education, but in healthcare, jobs programs, public housing. So it's no-brainer. It's a no-brainer why countries in the region are looking to China and also Russia and also Iran to develop their countries, because they have learned after 200 years of US imperialism that their countries were not developed. They were in fact underdeveloped. And finally, I'll say here that I think we should be very cautious in this moment, because it's very clear that there are many internal contradictions in the United States, massive political and economic crises going on, breaking out, crises of violence and mass shootings, growing poverty, homelessness. So there's a lot of domestic dysfunction. And clearly we see that US hegemony is being challenged around the world by countries everywhere, not just in Latin America, not just in Asia, not just in Africa, pretty much everywhere. So while we see those two contradictions happening, the internal conflicts in the US and the decline of US hegemony, we've seen that many politicians and military figures in the United States are calling for reasserting US hegemony over Latin America, over its so-called backyard, or as Joe Biden said, Latin America is the US front yard, which still shows this colonialist mentality. And we've seen, for instance, SOUTHCOM, US Southern Command, which is the US military branch responsible for operations in Latin America, has said very clearly that China and Russia are so-called threats in their hemisphere. They say that it's our hemisphere. Now, this is directly related to the Monroe Doctrine, which is an explicitly colonialist doctrine, as I spelled out. And it's also directly related to this new Cold War that I was discussing. The Pentagon published a new national security strategy in 2018, which said very clearly that the US considers China and Russia its chief adversaries. We just saw that in the Madrid summit this July, the NATO military cartel, which is led by the United States, announced a new strategic concept, which is essentially a new blueprint for its plans for the next decade. It was the first strategic concept in 12 years since 2010. And in this, they refer to Russia as a threat and China as a strategic competitor that is challenging the so-called rules-based international order, of course, in which Washington makes the rules and orders everyone around. And increasingly, when they talk about these supposed threats of Russia and China, and also Iran, they are saying that Russia, China, and Iran are not allowed to have bilateral consensual relations with countries in Latin America. So I just want to end on that note, because a lot of people in Latin America are increasingly concerned. They're very, they're obviously very clear about what's happening. They are reading US statements. They're reading the reports published by the Pentagon. They can see that the United States is treating Latin America not as a sovereign region of the world, but as its colonial backyard, and is telling other significant powers in the world, specifically China and Russia, that they can't have relations with those countries that have sovereign governments. This is a clear neo-colonial attitude, and it's going to potentially lead to more conflict. This is not conflict that China and Russia are looking for. They're not provoking the US into conflict. It's the US that is provoking the conflict, as it did in Ukraine, as it's doing now in Taiwan. This is extremely dangerous behavior. And of course, in the case of Ukraine, it could potentially lead to a nuclear exchange. Or in the case of Taiwan, this is the US attacking a province of China and supporting secessionist forces. Imagine if another country were to support secessionists in California. This is extremely dangerous behavior. And fortunately, there are many countries, many governments in Latin America that recognize this extremely dangerous behavior and are calling it out. And I'll just conclude here noting that on July 19th in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government celebrated the 43rd anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. Let's not forget, the Sandinista Revolution was to overthrow a US-backed dictator who was installed, his family was installed in power in the 1930s after US military occupation, and he governed as a US proxy, essentially, the Somoza regime. So the Sandinistas celebrated their 43rd anniversary of their revolution on July 19th, and President Daniel Ortega was joined on stage by representatives of the following countries: Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China. I think that shows very clearly that the countries in the region that are most dedicated to defending their sovereignty, and also the countries in the region that are most dedicated to funding social programs, healthcare and education and housing and fighting poverty to help their people, those are the countries that recognize the importance of the strategic bilateral mutually beneficial relationship with China. And that's, of course, why the United States is so dedicated into trying to disrupt that relationship. So thank you for having me. I think this is very important to talk about, and I'm glad I could share the space today.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was, you put a lot, you condensed a lot into your time there. Thank you. And one of the things that reminds me is, maybe we can come back to this, is, the fear of a good example. I think one of the more things get worse and worse in the US and in Canada, the more I think our governments and our ruling class is afraid that we will find out that these countries that we're supposed to hate actually have governments that are taking care of their people in a lot better ways than our governments do. And that's why we, our people here, the public, is kept in a constant state of hatred towards these countries. So thank you. I really appreciate your perspective every time, Ben. Next we have, excuse me, we're going to be hearing next from Dr. Liu Zongyi, who is the Secretary General of the Research Center for China-South Asia Cooperation at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. So Dr. Liu, please join us when you can.
Thank you very much, Kiran. And I also would like to thank CPAPD for inviting me to participate in this important event. I think this event is very meaningful. Today, I would like to talk about the development trend of the Belt and Road Initiative after the crisis in Ukraine. As we know, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has profoundly changed the geopolitical landscape and trend of the world, with significant implications for China, some positive and some negative. Now, some officials and scholars in the United States and the West are hyping the damage caused by the conflict to China's Belt and Road Initiative, especially to the railway freight route connecting China and Europe via Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus, and using it as a pretext to ask China to put pressure on Russia, which is mainly a Western narrative to provoke relations between China and Russia. Of course, the BRI has been negatively impacted by the Russia-Ukraine conflict in three ways. First, the Euro-Asia continental bridge has been directly affected. The China-Europe Railway Express has to go through Russia, Belarus, Poland, and all the Baltic coast, and then enter Europe. The route through Ukraine, although not the main route, was completely blocked with the war. At the same time, the China-Europe Railway Express no longer stops in Lithuania. However, the overall operation of China-Europe Railway Express is not significantly affected at the moment. And statistics show that in this June, the China-Europe Railway Express have recovered to the level of the same period last year. In addition, the airlines between China and Europe via Russia have been greatly affected. The second is the impact on Chinese investment in Ukraine and its neighboring countries. After the conflict, the contracted engineering projects signed by Chinese enterprises in Ukraine amounted to around 6.6 billion US dollars. The cooperation between Chinese listed companies and relevant enterprises in Ukraine is mostly concentrated in the wind power and photovoltaic fields, mainly on product supply, and some participate in the construction in the form of EPC. The outbreak of the conflict directly affected the construction and the operation of relevant projects. The third is on the trade. To some extent, China-EU trade has been affected by the conflict. But so far, the trade exchanges and investment agreement cooperation between China and Europe have not been greatly affected by the conflict. The cargo trade between China and Europe is mainly by sea coast, with railway transportation accounting for only 2.66%. However, due to EU sanctions against Russia, many European operators have also decided to withdraw from transportation through Russia and Belarus. So from the perspective of China's own interest and the interests of Ukraine, Russia, and other European countries, we hope that the war can be ended as soon as possible. The problem be solved through negotiation, and the peace can be restored as soon as possible, and the normal economic operation can be resumed. But the Russian-Ukraine conflict has not only had a negative impact on the BRI, but also led to some progress in the BRI. Firstly, the economic relations between China and Russia have become closer. You can find that. Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, almost all the political, business, and academic circles in Russia have turned their eyes to China and are encouraging the comprehensive expansion of cooperation with China in various fields. It's clear that Russians are increasingly turning to Chinese goods to replace goods previously imported from the West. And secondly, China's BRI and Russia's greater Euro-Asia partnership are further synergized. Since the proposal of BRI, China and Russia have been negotiating and promoting the synergy between the BRI and the greater Euro-Asia partnership. Euro-Asia is home to 75% of the world's population, 60% of global GDP, and 75% of known energy resources. The synergy of China's BRI with Russia's greater Euro-Asia partnership can radiate the entire Euro-Asian continent. Recently, good news came from the China-Mongolia-Russia Railway and China-Kazakhstan-Uzbekistan Railway. Third is that Euro-Asian countries are actively exploring routes that do not need to go through Russia. As the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues, Euro-Asian countries are actively developing alternative routes. In fact, the China-Europe Railway Express has already opened a Trans-Caspian and Black Sea route, which can bypass the second wall between the West and Russia. In June this year, the China-Europe Railway Express Wuhan opened a new route across the Caspian and Black Sea into Europe, passing through Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Romania, and other countries, and finally arriving in Duisburg, Germany. The EU and Kazakhstan plans strengthening cooperation on the Trans-Caspian route, and Finland has opened a route across the Caspian Sea via Kazakhstan and then from Azerbaijan to Georgia to Central Europe and then arriving in Finland. With the rapid development of the source route of China-Europe Railway Express, Georgia and Azerbaijan play an increasing prominent role in connecting the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. More alternative routes may emerge after the Russia-Ukraine conflict. From this point of view, the Russian-Ukraine conflict has promoted China and Europe to better avoid and exclude risks in their trade. After the war, Ukraine's well-developed railroad network could also provide a new transport route for China-Europe trade, leading to its further development. Then, what is the development trend of the BRI after the Russia-Ukraine conflict? I think, firstly, the BRI cooperation between China and Europe will be strengthened. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has added uncertainty to the cooperation between China and Europe in the short term. But the negative impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the European economy has further highlighted the demand for cooperation between China and Europe in the economic field. The world's largest market is in Asia, and the connection with China and the East Asian markets is the fundamental way out for the development of the EU. Promoting the shift of global industrial chains and supply chains for ideological purpose cannot change this objective fact. And secondly, I think in the future, China and the BRI will focus on the periphery, especially Southeast Asia. Now the China-Laos Railway has been opened to traffic, followed by China-Laos Thailand Railway. Then Malaysia will be included. In the future, there will be the China-Myanmar Railway in the west and China-Vietnam Railway in the east. The three railways will be connected into a network. The expressway is also under construction, and the China-Thailand expressway across the Making Railroad Bridge has been opened to traffic. China's trade with Southeast Asia is about $800 billion a year, and the annual investment is $20 billion plus more than $10 billion of Southeast Asian investment in China, which is more than $30 billion in both directions. And now we can find China and ASEAN have RCEP, and China ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and other soft mechanisms. ASEAN focus on economic development, not to coincide between China and the United States. And thirdly, after the Russian-Ukraine conflict, China will choose countries with a more stable political situation to invest and jointly build the Silk Road of green development, digital Silk Road, and the Silk Road of health. The Ukraine war is a new proxy war. The United States is a troublemaker in Eurasia, not only in Eurasia, but also in the whole world, just like our colleague said just now. The United States is fanning the flames everywhere with the purpose of creating proxy wars. In the context of the Federal Reserve's interest rate hike, many developing countries are facing economic crises and political turmoil. As happened in Sri Lanka, the United States would blame China for creating the so-called debt trap, which China will try to avoid. However, the destruction of the economic and political stability of these countries by the United States will have a backfire effect in the long run. And lastly, I think China will learn a lesson from the sanctions imposed by the United States and the West on Russia. The US-China competition over the BRI is largely a battle over rules and standards. In the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Western sanctions against Russia undermined the international credibility they had spent a century building. And the US-led standards lost their universality to the world. In terms of bank transfer payment system, internet technology specifications, etc. China clearly recognizes the consequences of using the US-led system, and China will seek to introduce alternatives. And other countries will also choose China rules and standards. I think I'll stop here. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Yes, lots of good points. Yeah, I have a question that we will maybe discuss afterwards as well. So for now, last but not least, we are going to hear from Q. Anthony Omene, who is another coordinator with the Toronto Peace Initiative and a journalist and activist and all around great person that we have come to know recently and has joined TPI. And so welcome, Q. Please unmute and go ahead when you're ready.
First of all, Kiran, I take heavy exception to you calling me an activist in front of this audience. You know how I feel about that word. But regardless, I also want to apologize to the audience for my informal appearance. Thanks to my sister and comrade, Kiran, I was dragged out of bed after suffering a horrible migraine all last night and today. But she stressed to me the importance of this meeting. So I am putting the needs of the group ahead of the needs of myself, which is to drink some hot tea and lie down and go to sleep. I'd like to begin with a passage from one of my favorite authors, a Black revolutionary by the name of George Jackson, who was effectively sentenced to an indefinite sentence. Before knowing about George Jackson, I didn't even know that you could receive an indefinite sentence in prison for robbing a convenience store. But when he was imprisoned in the late 1960s, he discovered revolutionary politics. He was introduced to Black revolutionary politics in prison and became a lifelong activist until his unfortunate murder by prison guards in San Quentin in 1971. But he writes in his diary, which you can read in the book called Soledad Brother, he writes, "After the Civil War, the form of slavery changed from chattel to economic slavery, and we were thrown into the labor market to compete at a disadvantage with poor whites. Ever since that time, our principal enemy must be isolated and identified as capitalism. The slaver was and is the factory owner, the businessman of capitalist America, the man responsible for employment, wages, prices, control of the nation's institutions, and culture. It was the capitalist infrastructure of Europe and the US which was responsible for the rape of Africa and Asia. Capitalism murdered those 30 million in the Congo. Believe me, the European and Anglo-American capitalists would never have wasted the ball and powder were it not for the profit principle. The men, all the men who went into Africa and Asia, the fleas who climbed on that elephant's back with rape on their minds, richly deserve all that they are called. Every one of them deserved to die for their crimes. So did the ones who are still in Vietnam, Angola, Union of South Africa. But we must not allow the emotional aspects of these issues, the scum at the surface, to obstruct our view of the big picture, the whole rotten hunk. It was capitalism that armed the ships, free enterprise that launched them, private ownership of property that fed the troops. Imperialism took up where the slave trade left off. It wasn't until after the slave trade ended that America, England, and France, and the Netherlands invaded and settled in on Afro-Asian soil in earnest. As the European Industrial Revolution took hold, new economic attractions replaced the older ones. Chattel slavery was replaced by neo-slavery. Capitalism, free enterprise, private ownership of public property armed and launched the ships and fed the troops. It should be clear that it was the profit motive that kept them there. I bring this up because it's become en vogue over the last decade or so for people in the West, and very disappointingly, Black people in the West, to insinuate that there is some new form of colonialism that's taking place on the African continent, and that the African continent is being somewhere between duped and taken advantage of by so-called Chinese benefactors who are engaged in what they call debt trap diplomacy, which is an interesting means of projection, given that debt trap diplomacy has been the entire strategy of Europe and the United States through its financial arm, the International Monetary Fund, to seize and gain control of African resources by essentially lading those countries down with debt, forcing them to privatize their public institutions and enslaving them in exchange for natural resources. As a matter of fact, today I saw news which was brought to my attention by an organization called Blavity, which is an independent, supposedly, news network that is led by Black people, celebrating the ascension of Michael Langley to the position of 4-star general. Michael Langley, as a 4-star general, would be the first Black man in the 246-year history of the United States Marines to rise to that position, and as such, he would take over the United States African Command, or AFRICOM. Now, since the mid 2000s, especially since the 2011 destruction of Libya by the United States, the U.S. has engaged in two forms of diplomacy with Africa, both of them extremely violent. One is economic diplomacy, which has essentially forced African nations to beg once more at the feet of the IMF. The latest example of that would be Zambia, where President Hichilema, after a contentious relationship with China and having won an election, immediately turned away from Chinese loans and debt obligations, which China had at several points offered to renegotiate with the country of Zambia, gone back to the IMF, which immediately proposed more structural adjustment loans to relieve the defaulting Zambian debt. It is also engaged in covert action, the culmination of which have been several coups on the African continent. So there was a coup in Mali back in 2021, a coup attempt in Sudan, and in Burkina Faso as well. In addition to that, Joe Biden's launch of airstrikes and military action in Somalia. So then the question is, well, where is this all going? And what is this? What purpose does this all serve? Well, there's countries like Nigeria that have engaged in infrastructure projects throughout the African continent for the purpose of connecting Africa with itself and connecting people in those nations with themselves. For the most part, during the scramble for Africa and the period of colonialism, there were infrastructural developments on the African continent, but they were primarily for the purpose of extracting African goods and then shipping them out to ports, upon which time they would be sent out to their colonial masters. So in the course of African development, they have never been able to get past primary industries. Africa has not been able to fully industrialize because it was kept from industrializing in the first place. The idea of African nations being able to not only extract natural resources, of which Africa is abundantly clear that natural resources on the continent are the reason for European interest and American interest on the continent. It's able to, despite the fact that it's faced droughts, natural disasters, etc., Africa is capable of feeding itself 2 times over, plus the rest of the world while it's at it. But the point is, it was not allowed to industrialize, and all of the roads, the railways, and so on, lead from agricultural areas and mining areas to ports where everything is shipped off to Europe. As a matter of fact, 90% of all roads and railway in Africa are present in one single country, which is South Africa, which was one of the most heavily colonized countries. And of course, we're familiar with the history of apartheid in South Africa. Ever since engaging in trade relationships and financial relationships with China, specifically through China Exim Bank, there have been multiple projects on the African continent and then several nations to be able to connect countries with themselves. So, for example, Nigeria has a massive project that's connecting Lagos and Kano, 2 of the major civilian centers in Nigeria, whereas before they had no ability to do so. Being able to travel from Lagos to Kano meant that you either had enough money to charter an airplane or you had to travel through very dangerous territory. The exact same thing is also present with the railway that is connecting Abuja and oh my goodness, I forget the name of the city, but there's a corridor from Nigeria's capital city, Abuja, and Kaduna, which is one of the most dangerous corridors for travel in Nigeria. As a matter of fact, people are afraid to use the roads and streets connecting Abuja and Kaduna, because there have been everything from terrorist actions to armed robbery to insurrection. It is an incredibly dangerous road to travel. And the ICIR in Nigeria actually noted a couple of months ago that China's assistance in building railway infrastructure from Abuja to Kaduna is actually going to save lives. On top of that, the African continent, every single country except for one, which was Mauritius, engaged in a free trade agreement. And that was actually one of Africa's largest impediments to being able to develop themselves. When goods cross one border, these imaginary borders, by the way, that were imposed on by former colonial masters, but when goods cross from one border to the other, the price of tariffs has ended up so high that it restricted trade. So, for example, Ethiopia and Eritrea, being so rich in the material goods that would form concrete, were unable to supply those goods to other countries that were rapidly industrializing, primarily Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Ghana, etc., in West and Central Africa. So those goods had to be imported from China. Now, people say that the African continent should be able to support itself, and in many ways, it has been trying to support itself. And the only way that it can do so is through infrastructure. How then can you move goods from one country to another? How can you engage in the process of industrialization? How then can you develop your nations and have people that are self-sufficient and able to move from an economy that primarily extracts resources to an economy that is able to produce finished products in its own territory? How can you do that if you don't have the ability to build infrastructure in the first place? What we've also heard is that Chinese laborers are moving to the African continent and taking the place of African workers. And that, while that may be true to some extent, when you look at what Chinese workers were doing on the African continent in the first place, it tells a completely different story. So, for example, in Ethiopia, there was a railway infrastructure being built by China, but the engineers that were going to commandeer these trains had to be trained first. So many of them ended up going to China to receive an education, not only to build the railways, but also to conduct the trains. And at such time that they were sufficiently educated that they could take these jobs once completed, the Chinese workers that were fulfilling those jobs went home. As a matter of fact, since the year 2017, there's been a steadily declining number of Chinese workers on the African continent. I believe there's less than 22,000 workers on the entire continent at this point. It's been steadily declining because many of the workers that are taking up education and taking up training for these infrastructure-related jobs and for these engineering jobs are being trained well enough that they can take the work on their own. And in areas where there has been labor exploitation up to the point of violence, primarily in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo and in Zambia, when there has been complaints raised by locals that some of these companies were taking advantage of workers and even inflicting physical violence against them, those workers were sent home and there were apologies offered. So what does this have to do with the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Well, there was a tweet by Samantha Power, one of the most evil human beings on the face of the planet, in my opinion. Samantha Power, who's been an advisor to various Democratic presidents for going on 2 decades now, filmed a video from somewhere in the Horn of Africa. If you go and look at the tweet, I'm not even convinced she was in Africa in the first place, talking about Russia's plan to starve the African continent by stopping Ukrainian grain from being shipped to Africa in the first place. Now, not only does this comport with this American myth that the African continent is not capable of feeding itself, while not telling the truth about the fact that the African continent has been prevented from feeding itself. Why is a country so rich in natural resources as Africa having to depend on Ukrainian wheat shipments? The idea that Russia has been engaged in some sort of war, as she says, for no reason, for the purpose of starving the African continent, she says, is absolutely preposterous. But that is what they've been telling people at home in the United States. With the amount of censorship that happens in the US and the restriction of the flow of information so that Americans can't even get a full perspective on what's happening in that conflict in the first place. Try finding a full speech by Vladimir Putin. You're going to come up completely empty-handed. YouTube doesn't allow doesn't allow RT, for example, to place Putin speeches anywhere on the site. You basically have to circumvent and go to alternative sites to find this information. Americans are not getting that full perspective, so they think that Africa is a starving, diseased, and poor continent when it's exactly the opposite. As George L. Jackson said, they would not be there with ball and powder if the continent wasn't rich in the first place. And on top of that, Ukraine, which is supposedly the last bastion of democracy, in Eastern Europe, away from the barbaric Asiatic hordes to be found in Russia. I'm gonna stop being diplomatic for a second and just tell the truth. Earlier this year, when the conflict began, I was notified that there were students in Eastern Ukraine in a city called Sumy, which is one of the closest regions to the Donbass territory, that students were trapped at the Sumy State University because they were prevented from leaving by school administrators that told them if they left, knowing that there was a run-up to this conflict happening, if they left, even to preserve their own safety, they may be either suspended or expelled from the school, and that they would not be able to return and receive all of their credits. So they essentially held these students hostage. When the conflict began, those students were basically stranded in Sumy for weeks. Being stranded in that city not only meant that they had to hide out in bomb shelters, but they were not able to purchase food because there's no cash available from ATMs. They were not able to use debit cards because debit services were defunct at the time. They had no ability to use credit cards. Stores were out of water. They had to collect water off of park benches and stoops and boil the water to drink to be able to survive. This happened because Ukrainians had no sympathy and did not view these students as human beings whose lives were worthy of preserving. These were students that were not simply there for any sort of undergraduate studies. These were people who were training to become doctors and engineers so that they could go back to their home countries and help develop their countries. While in Western Ukraine, many students and even residents who were of African origin attempted to flee the country in the first place and were prevented from boarding trains. And many excuses were proffered, not only by Ukraine and not only by the United States officials, but they were proffered by Black Americans that had gone to Ukraine to cover the conflict, and for some reason took their side on that perspective. And what you're seeing now is the breakdown of a relationship, of an international relationship and cooperation between Black people in the West and African people on the African continent and elsewhere in the world. And that's part of the purpose of imperialism, is to be able to separate us from each other, but then use the exact same strategies, the violent strategies of alienation and labor exploitation that were practiced on the African continent and are still being practiced on the African continent, are being practiced in the United States, Canada, the UK, and elsewhere. And the reason that China has to be demonized, that China has to be vilified, is the possibility of any of these countries being able to develop their own relationships, to have self-determination, to have independence from this neo-colonial project, is so offensive and so obscene in the eyes of the United States and the EU that they have to use not only information or disinformation warfare to prevent this from happening, but even tie the possibility of offering foreign aid to countries that they deliberately impoverished in the first place to the cooperation that those countries, according to the EU emissary to Africa, that those countries may have to stand up and denounce Vladimir Putin, that they would have to announce that they are on the US side before they're able to receive foreign aid. She proposed a transactional relationship between foreign aid and African support for these proxy wars in the first place. So what I have to say about the Russia-Ukraine conflict as it relates to Africa is something that I find very offensive to me, which is the idea that Black people in the West ought to support the West's ambitions on African territory and the West's ambitions against China and against Russia. None of this has anything to do with us. I've heard people from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, for example, from Trinidad, Barbados. I've heard people from Latin America. I've heard people from Africa that have said that there is some sort of a Chinese plot to stick these countries into debt trap diplomacy. And then I point them to an article that I read a few months ago where the Chinese emissary to the Horn of Africa, Xu Yibing, apologies if I mispronounced the name, I've only read it in print, I haven't heard it pronounced out loud, said that the Chinese strategy for the Horn of Africa is not to export weapons or arms and not to engage in coercion of these countries, but to export scholarship, to export students, to export engineers, to help develop these countries in the first place. And the idea that there's a country that's willing to offer a helping hand for these countries to climb out from underneath the state of stagnation and underdevelopment that the West forced upon them, that being so offensive that they're trying to turn us against each other, to me, is not only offensive, but the more offensive part to me is that there are Black people in the West who are willing to go along with it.
Woo! Wow. Oh, camera. There you go. Wow, that was a lot. And you covered a lot, and there's even more. In fact, I feel like I have more questions now than I did before, but thank you for that, Q. Appreciate you bringing such an important perspective. We do have some
Anytime.
questions for, yeah, thank you. We have some questions for each of our speakers in this section. So I will ask if we could go through those. If you can limit your answers to around 5 minutes or so, that would be great. Not going to time you or anything, but just so that we can get through the rest of this portion. So first of all, question for Ben Norton. What is the best way to counter anti-socialist narratives in the West regarding Venezuela, China, Nicaragua, in your opinion? All of these countries that are slowly joining the, and a sort of Eastern development united front of some kind, but the propaganda in the West is strong against any actually existing socialist state, or I would say any country that really stands to in any way not play by the US's rules. And those countries are demonized. Some people will even say they know people from these places that think that socialism is bad. Now, our job in the West as anti-war, anti-imperialist socialists is to describe why these socialist movements are good. So what are some, in your opinion, some ways we can make the connection between the working class in the imperial core and the working class in the global South?
Well, first of all, understand that many of the economic problems these countries suffer from are caused by U.S. aggression, illegal so-called sanctions, which are completely illegal according to international law. The real name is unilateral coercive measures, or an even better name is economic warfare. You know, the socialist governments in the region are heavily targeted by U.S. aggression, constant coup attempts, a briefly successful U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela in April 2002, constant coup attempts since then, including violent coup attempts in 2014 and 2017, the ongoing coup attempt that began in 2019 with Juan Guaido, this unelected coup leader handpicked by Washington, the brutally violent coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018, not to mention the Contra death squads armed and trained by the CIA in the 1980s to destabilize the country, and the economic blockade imposed on Nicaragua in the 1980s that led to the Sandinista Front losing power in 1990. And of course, Cuba. I mean, this country has been under sanctions more than I think any other country in history. The DPRK has been under sanctions for many decades, but I think technically the US blockade on Cuba is, I think, the oldest, goes back to 1962 officially, but actually the sanctions really began in 1960 and 1961. So we're talking about over 60 years of illegal sanctions. And every single year for over 20 years at the United Nations, almost every single country on earth votes against the illegal US blockade on Cuba, excluding sometimes apartheid Israel, and more recently Colombia and the far-right regime in Brazil joined the US. But consistently, 189 or 190 of the 193 member states at the United Nations vote every year to condemn the illegal US blockade on Cuba, and yet it continues. This is a blockade that harms the people of Cuba, as all sanctions do. They don't harm the government, they harm the people. And that's the intentional goal. We've seen that the Biden administration's State Department official who oversees sanctions on Iran, the special Iran envoy named Richard Nephew, he published a book called The Art of Sanctions, which is really the art of sadism. And in this book, he says very clearly that the US sanctions on Iran led to a rapidly increasing food prices, including during Islamic holidays and important religious celebrations. And he boasted of that. He boasted of hurting the Iranian economy, hurting average Iranian people. He called those successes of the US illegal sanctions on the country. So this is economic warfare aimed at the civilian populations of these countries. And we can't understand the economic problems in a country like Venezuela without understanding that economic warfare. Now, furthermore, we also need to understand the situation of these countries in the context of the region, because frequently one of the tactics used by propagandists in the imperial core is to compare apples to oranges. they compare formerly colonized countries in the global south that are still suffering from partial colonization and imperialist aggression to imperialist countries in the imperial core that developed themselves based on exploitation of the periphery and slavery. So they compare, for instance, the level of economic development of the United States, which developed its wealth on mass enslavement of Africans, genocide of the indigenous populations of the modern day so-called Americas, and of course, massive brutal exploitation of workers across the global south. They'll compare Florida to Cuba, ignoring the fact that Cuba was a Spanish colony, and then it was a US colony, and then it overthrew a US-backed right-wing dictator in 1959 and has been punished ever since. So we have to understand the situation in the region and the neighboring countries. We should compare the economic situation of average Cuban workers to the economic situation of workers in the Dominican Republic. That is a much better, much more historically accurate comparison. Understand the situation for average Venezuelans as opposed to the situation suffered by many people in Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor, which has a similar level of economic development and went through a similar process of colonization by Spain and neo-colonialism. Colombia happens to have the great honor of having the most massacres in the world of activists. It has held that great honor for many years now. Last year, there were over 90 massacres of activists, of human rights activists and land defenders, indigenous leaders, Afro-Colombian leaders in Colombia. We're talking about hundreds of activists are murdered every single year by death squads and paramilitary groups that are linked to the state. The Colombian government itself acknowledged in a conservative estimate that in the 8 years of the administration of Álvaro Uribe Vélez, the right-wing closest US ally in Colombia, his government killed at least 6,400 civilians and then dressed them up as so-called combatants. And they said that they killed 6,400 armed guerrillas. Actually, they were 6,400 civilians. The government itself published that figure, acknowledging it, which means the actual figure is probably many thousands more. There's a reason we don't hear about the brutal violence that is systemic in Colombia and deeply linked to the state, not to mention its deep links to drug cartels, which are also linked to the state, and large, significant political parties and politicians like people like Uribe and the current president, Iván Duque, who only came to power because, as the prosecutor's office of Colombia acknowledged, he bought votes using drug money from a notorious drug dealer, Nene Hernandez. So all of those facts are conveniently erased because Colombia is a major US ally. It has 6 to 9 US military bases that we know of, depending on the estimate published. And of course, Colombia is a strategic US ally that's used against Venezuela. So we have to be able to compare the situation in Latin America to other countries in the region of similar levels of economic development. Compare average Venezuelans to average Colombians, average Bolivians to average Peruvians, average Cubans to average Dominicans. And then, of course, we can see a much fairer and much better example. And we'll see that those socialist governments invest significantly more in healthcare, education, housing, jobs programs, poverty alleviation. And when you compare it to their neighbors, the standard of living and the quality of life for average working people is significantly greater, despite the brutal economic war and hybrid war and coup attempts waged by the United States against them.
Thank you for that, Ben. Thank you very much. Yes. There was one more question. If you could you comment on the recent news that Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, among others, will be participating in joint military exercises next month? I had not heard of that. So do you have any info?
I've investigated this. I don't think it's true. The original claim came from a right-wing think tank in Latin America. And of course, we know that there is a long history of the corporate media laundering fake stories by claiming that it came from so-called experts at a think tank, never mentioning, the partisan orientation of these very conservative pro-imperialist think tanks and their funding sources from foreign governments. I have not seen any evidence of this. It has not been confirmed by any of the governments allegedly participating in it. It seems to be part of this fear mongering that we see by the right wing in Latin America, which is very pro-imperialist, because of course they represent the oligarchy. Many of them are descendants of the European colonialists who have not only economic relations with the United States and economic interests, but also in some ways kind of cultural interests and have personal relationships with US imperialism. So I haven't seen any evidence of this. Now, it is true that China, Russia, and Iran have carried out at least 3 military exercises in the Indian Ocean, and they have every right to do so, especially considering that the United States is threatening all 3 countries constantly. The US is currently waging basically war on Russia, and the US has been waging a hybrid war on Iran for many years with more illegal sanctions. The US murdered the second most powerful and important figure in the Iranian government, General Qasem Soleimani, who defeated ISIS, by the way. That's how the US thanked the man who defeated ISIS. And of course, the US has brutal sanctions on China after waging this trade war, and it continues to try to destroy any competition from Chinese companies like Huawei. So it makes perfect sense, given that the US is waging a war on Russia, waging a war on Iran, is trying to start a war on China by encouraging secessionist movements in Taiwan and Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet. It makes sense for those countries to do trilateral military exercises, given the very real US military threats against them and Washington's attempt to try to bring other countries in the region together in this military coalition they call the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, which everyone knows is an anti-China military alliance, not to mention the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US military alliance, which is also threatening to give Australia nuclear technology, which could lead to a nuclear arms race in the Pacific region. So the US is the aggressor, and it makes sense for countries in the region to form regional security pacts to defend themselves.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, it's okay when the US has multiple military conglomerates around the world, but nobody else can do that. All the non-proliferation has to be done by other countries, not by the United States, which is the only country that has dropped nukes on civilians, of course. Thank you, Ben. That was very, very informative, as always. Very much appreciate you. I have a question for Dr. Liu. Dr. Liu, the US is pressuring the EU to end its trade with Russia or to seriously throttle the EU's trade with Russia, especially the imports of gas and other commodities. But this is something they've been trying to do to drive a wedge between the EU and China for years, as far as I know. So in your opinion, has the Russia-Ukraine conflict made the EU more or less receptive to US's manipulation, especially when it comes to China, but also in general?
Yes, I think in the short term, the EU and China trade maybe will be influenced by the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the pressure of the United States. But in the long run, now the main problem for Russia, for EU is that some politicians in European countries, they mainly focus on ideology and values, not on their economic development and the welfare of the people. So in the long run, if they recognize this, and if the European people recognize this reality, I think they will change their policy towards China and Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I suspected. Okay, and so finally, Q, it's kind of a general question, but in this, within Canada, the narrative of war, is so one-sided in the media, especially, right? I mean, you have the right wing, which, or at least, I mean, it's sort of hard to say because, the lines are sometimes blurry, but when it comes to war, it seems the so-called right and the so-called left are united. They're always pro-war, pro-increasing the military budgets, pro-buying, F-35s,
you'll never see less daylight between two sets of people with supposedly opposing ideals than when you bring up the prospect of war with China.
Yeah. And, you know, the entire Canadian Parliament, was it a year and a half or something ago, voted to condemn China for the so-called genocide in Xinjiang, which of course is entirely a distortion made up by, you know, Westerners, like right-wing, far right-wing Westerners. So my question, I guess the question is, this I'm not even sure if the person still wants me to ask the question, but I will ask. So what are some tactics, or what are some ways that we can make our neighbors, let's say, or just average Canadians, understand that these Western ruling class elites are the problem, they're the enemy, and not, you know, some foreign government, which is always seen to be, you know, villainized so much. I mean, that is, I think, for us living here, it is the essential question. So, you know, obviously, you know, we need a stronger presence online. Yes. And I know that you and some other people engage in that, you know, in a kind of trying to push back against some of this information war that the West is waging against China. Of course, we don't have the resources, right? Like, we don't have the kind of reach or the resources that you know, people have that go on MSNBC and CNN and Washington Post and whatnot. So, what are some other things that we can do? How do we even talk to our neighbors about this stuff who are sometimes so completely brainwashed? You know, like, what are some ideas that you might have?
Well, I will say that I think it's a bit of a mistake to focus on mainstream news sources like CBC, for example, but also, you know, MSNBC, CNN, etc. I find that generally for people that I speak to in day-to-day life, and, you know, I am out in my community fairly often, just talking to regular people, my neighbors, etc. On top of, like, you know, the kind of writing and the public work that I do. I spend a lot of time talking to people, and I would say that for the most part, they use these news organizations as a means of keeping up with what's happening on a day-to-day basis, but they're not necessarily using them as a source for analysis. So what you found, especially with all of the misinformation and mixed messages that were coming from government sources, but also being co-signed by large news organizations. A lot of them have lost faith in the government and subsequently lost faith in the media. So they use the media as sort of I guess, like to understand what is happening in the world, but they don't use the media to understand how these things that are happening in the world, or how these events that are coming up are happening. For that, I would say a lot of people are turning to alternative news sites. Most of them are independent. Many of them have been castigated by the West as sources of not only disinformation, but possibly spreading fascism. So they're alternative channels like OAN, for example, some of these far-right networks, Turning Point USA, etc. Some of them are organizations that have been, I think, unfairly demonized as contributing to anti-vaccination and pro-Russian information. I'm thinking, for example, of the Gray Zone. Some of them are people and organizations that are simply telling the truth about history and the state of the world. I'm thinking of, for example, my friend and comrade here, Ben Norton, but also people like Denny Haifong, that have been everything from profiled in the New York Times as purveyors of disinformation, to being banned from social media platforms for telling the truth, for example, about the history of the event at Tiananmen Square. I would say that the most efficient way to change people's minds is to have conversations with them directly, but also to branch out into independent media. I think that independent media is going to be the future of how people consume information and how they're able to form their analyses. I mean, it already is. Most people under the age of 40 are not sitting down and watching cable television anymore. They're getting a lot of their information from YouTube. They're getting their information from alternative sites. So I think that there's already a good trend happening, whether we agree with the information that's being passed along through these sites or not. And I highly encourage people to, branch out beyond just, the New York Times or the Toronto Star or the National Post or wherever they're getting their information from. And also to stop stop worrying about what information is being carried in these pages. Obviously, if there's information that is completely wrong or hypocritical, yes, absolutely call that out. But to expect that a news organization like CBC or organizations like the New York Times or MSNBC, that they're going to change their tune, they're going to allow people with a more principled left position or a more well-informed position, a more nuanced position, are going to appear on the air. It's simply not going to happen. It's not in their best interest. It's not in their advertisers' interest. It's not in the interests of their corporate owners. Instead, focus on creating your own platforms and providing that information on your own, because frankly, there's no help coming. There's not going to be any rich benefactor that appears out of nowhere and corrects all of the mistakes and outright lies and fabrication that's being proffered by mainstream news. They're not going to have a sudden crisis of conscience and change their minds. This is what they were there to do in the first place. These organizations don't exist to inform or to challenge the powerful. They exist to reinforce the status quo. And the sooner we come to grips with that, I think the sooner that we're going to be able to do something effective.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a much larger discussion that we could probably dedicate another couple of hours to. How to reach people just out there.
Just as an addendum to that, I found it wildly interesting that New York Times, for example, ran profiles of not only the Azov Battalion, but other far-right paramilitary organizations in Ukraine as recently as last year. And yet, the moment that the Russian special operation in Ukraine was launched, suddenly the Azov Battalion were the saviors of Mariupol. You would see stories in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. And full disclosure, I write semi-frequently for the Globe and Mail, and even in their political section as well. But I would see that they would post stories about heroic Canadians that are going off to Ukraine to fight against the tyrant Vladimir Putin, and they were wearing the colors and insignias of far-right organizations like the OUN and UPA in Ukraine. That our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was photographed by several news agencies and videotaped at Toronto City Hall with the mayor of Toronto holding a scarf with the OUN's colors, red and black, that said Slava Ukraini. And out of the mouth of an organization like that, it wasn't just simply a glory to Ukraine. It was a far-right nationalist slogan. It was a slogan of people that murdered over 100,000 Jews and Poles in two different cities, in Katyn and in Galicia. So I would say that these organizations know what they're doing. When a company like CTV, that is owned by Bell Media, one of the largest telecommunications companies in Canada, when an organization like that has Stepan Bandera's grandson, Steve Bandera, his name is actually Steve Bandera, he is a producer for CTV, and they know exactly who he is. And he's ran news hits that were pro-Banderite in nature. He's attempted to rehab his grandfather's image on the CTV payroll. They're completely aware of what people like this are doing. They're aware of what Chrystia Freeland is doing, which is pairing up Canada's interests with far-right Ukrainian nationalists and to stall the development of African nations with the possible aid and assistance from China, Russia, and other nations that we consider enemies. They're fully aware of the Banderite attempt to rehab the image of Ukrainian far-right nationalists that fought against the Soviets during World War II, that essentially sabotaged the Red Army's efforts to defeat Nazism. They know what they're doing, and they don't care. So it's up to us to do something about it on our own, because nobody from any of these organizations is going to do anything about it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is just incredible that we have Stepan Bandera's grandson writing in one of the mainstream media outlets in Canada. It's absolutely atrocious. But that's what we're dealing with here. In the imperialist countries, we're dealing with an entrenched white supremacist colonial settler colonial, ruling class that I think that the issue with, the antagonism towards China and other countries like Russia and Iran and Venezuela is ideological as well as material, right? So thank you. I want to thank all of our speakers. We're going to hear from one more person. But before we do, I want to thank all of our speakers Ian, Professor Zhao, Nigel, Ben, Professor Liu, and Q, and to the CPAPD representatives who have helped coordinate this whole event. So for, just some closing thoughts and to bring everything together, I invite Dr. Tao, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the CPAPD, to come up and share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Kiran. Time is up, so I will make a very brief conclusion. First, on behalf of the CPAPD Secretariat, I'd like to extend our thanks to TPI, Toronto Peace Initiative, especially Kiran, for organizing this online dialogue, a very important, useful, constructive dialogue. And our appreciations also go to all excellent scholars for your wonderful presentations, valuable observations. My colleagues and I have learned much from you. Second, after Ukraine crisis, our world entered a new period of turbulence and transformation. The world is becoming more unsafe and unstable, full of challenges, risks, even conflicts. We are facing bloc confrontation among major powers, even possible new Cold War. So I can't help thinking about a paragraph by Charles Dickens, English writer. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. All in all, the world is on fire. So at this moment, we need new thoughts, concepts, initiatives on security. I suggest we start the Global Security Initiative put forward by President Xi Jinping this year. Maybe we will have some aspirations for safeguarding world peace and regional stability. Last but not least, thank you all again. CPAPD will continue to organize online dialogues with our partners. We look forward to your attention and supporting. I stop here, Kiran. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tao. Appreciate your closing thoughts. Yes, I think definitely that there needs to be a worldwide cooperation, and definitely people should look into President Xi Jinping's Global Security Initiative. That plus just the Belt and Road Initiative. If you don't know what it is, you really need to look it up and look up actual Chinese sources or sources coming out of, other countries, like, for example, Pakistan. There's some really great writings out there about CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, along with many of the agreements with various countries in Latin America and Africa. So I want to thank again all of our panelists today, as well as our TPI coordinators who are also sending us questions for our panelists. I thank you again, and to the CPAPD, very much thank you. Looking forward to working with you all. This is Kiran Fatima from the Toronto Peace Initiative saying good night.